we hear in Genesis these words that Adam and Eve were naked, but they had no shame. And this idea of shame is a very interesting concept. Because what is shame? Shame comes up in us when something which we thought was secret, which we thought was part of our intimate sphere, where no one had any idea about what it was, all of a sudden comes to the fore and other people know about it. And what is interesting with shame is that what we find is bad is not the fact that something bad has become known, because I can be ashamed of something very good, but the fact that something all of a sudden is public, which I wanted private, that something has been, so to speak, torn out of my interior without my permission. And that's a very interesting idea, because it shows that shame attests to the dignity of the person, that all of a sudden there's something in us, in the deepest of our hearts, that has a desire that our freedom, that our liberty not be compelled to do something it doesn't want to do. Now, when we speak about shame in the sense of Genesis, they were naked without shame, what does that mean? Because what we're speaking about, we're not speaking about 2 4-year-olds, or 1 4-year-old who goes around, escapes from the bathtub and the soap and so on, and kind of goes naked running around the house because it has no experience or has no understanding of its own sexuality. No, you're talking about 2 adults who very well and fully know who they are as persons, as man and as woman, and yet they find no shame. Why does that happen? Now, maybe this is kind of a stupid example because it comes from our ranch that I experienced years ago when we were upset at our bulls when they broke out in the wrong time of year and made the cows pregnant so that we had calves with minus 50 degrees. What did we do? We got very angry at those bulls, but we didn't take them to court. We didn't take them to prison. Why? Because they had no responsibility for what they were doing. But interestingly enough, with us humans, precisely that happens, because our actions bring with them a responsibility. As soon as I do something through a free act, I'm responsible for what I've just done. And that is a super interesting concept, because that means that freedom and responsibility are totally correlated. And a lot of times today we hear that freedom means no responsibility. You can do what you want. And all of a sudden we realize, well, no, freedom has a lot to do with responsibility. And then we bring in another concept and say, okay, when 2 people love each other, what happens? There has to be freedom. Because you can't say to someone, listen, you gotta love me, you understand? No, that you can't do that. You can only receive love freely, and you can only give it freely. And that means that there's a correlation between love, freedom, and responsibility. And that means also that the more love you have for someone, the more you want to be responsible for that person, the more you look for responsibility. And egotism does the exact opposite. Egotism flees from responsibility. And that's another theme maybe we could talk about another time, about why, for example, something crazy as a one-night stand has nothing to do with love, because you don't want responsibility for the other person. It has a lot to do with egotism. You're using the other person to get what you want. And the possibility of a child, we definitely want to avoid that, because that means that all of a sudden I've said through my body yes to this other person, and I just can't walk away. Now, when we take a step further and talk about shame, what happens with shame is that these two people, Adam and Eve, and John Paul II, when he speaks about Genesis, he says Genesis is spoken in a mythical language, which means that sometimes a picture says more than 1,000 words. In other words, Adam and Eve is also the experience of each one of us. These 2 people, when they come together and when they are naked without shame, it's in the context of in the garden. And in the garden is an image of the intimate sphere between man and woman. You have another text in the Old Testament, in the Song of Songs, where it says, my bride is an enclosed garden. In other words, you can't just go in unless she gives you the key. And Adam and Eve are in this garden, and they're naked without shame. Why? Because they love each other. In other words, what happens with love absorbs shame. And the more you really love someone, the less shame there's going to be. Why? Because you have nothing to hide. You don't have to be afraid that all of a sudden the person is going to see something in you that you don't want. You can let yourself fall into the other person's arms just as you are, because you know the other person is going to accept you as you are. You don't have to be afraid to show yourself for what you are. And that's something very, very, very beautiful. If you can have a relationship where there needs to be no shame. Now, if we take one step further, though, we realize something else which is very interesting, and that is that when you take shame into a relationship of love, it's not that shame has disappeared, it's been absorbed. And in that very moment where one of those partners, the man or the woman, realizes that the other person is using you more as an object for their own pleasure instead of accepting you as you are in your entirety, in that very moment, shame is immediately back. It comes back immediately to the forefront, and the doors are closed. You start wearing masks again. You don't show yourself for what you are. There's secrets, there's areas of your heart that you don't want to show. Why? Because you're realizing, hey, the other person is not respecting me for what I am. And what I hope for you and for myself and all of us is that we build relationships where there can be nakedness without shame, where there are no secrets, where I can be what I am, where I'm not looking for something from the other person for my own interests, but I accept and love the other person truly.